Hello and welcome back to the Linguapop podcast. My name's Emily.
I'm Shreya.
And this is the podcast where we talk about multilingualism and the representation of different languages through pop culture and the media. And today we're going to be focusing on some examples from France.
So today the main question is, can plurilingual art actually be achieved? And I think we're probably going to look at this through various examples of maybe comic strips and other kind of media examples that we've looked into ourselves. So let's start with the comic strip L'Arbre du Futur. For context, it is just a novel. It's a retelling of the author's childhood in France, and it received backlash but also a lot of praise because it did try to convey life in France, Libya and Syria and the difficulties in switching languages through it. But also it was seen as xenophobic and perhaps propagating stereotypes about Arabs.
Yeah, I think the sort of medium of comics is really significant in France as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know that they're really popular and lots of children read them in France.
Yeah.
Like maybe more than in countries like the UK.
Yeah.
I know it's a really big thing.
Mm-hmm. And like through the idea of trying to create plurilingual art, I think comics are great because obviously they include images and it kind of bridges that gap between one language and another without the use of translation.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
They can be really easy to understand for children as well, obviously with the mix of images and text.
Yeah. I think in one of the parts of the story we were looking at, it was just an extract of him trying to get French people to understand how to pronounce his name. I think he did it quite creatively with the use of images and stuff. But he also did say that the actual tone of his name is lost in French. So what do you think about that in the context of plurilingual art?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it can show the difficulties of translation and sort of carrying the same meaning across into different languages. Like, is that always possible to give the same meaning in plurilingual or multilingual art?
Mm-hmm.
And would all of the readers view it the same depending on maybe which languages they can speak and understand?
Yeah, I think the reading goes quite nicely into that.
Yeah. So some people have argued that multilingualism, which is like the presence of multiple languages, can actually uphold the idea that languages are separate because it can kind of create borders between language and say, oh, this is like all of the different languages we've included, like, but also kind of separating them in a way. For example, in his 2016 journal article, Robert Young argues that multilingualism and the presence of multiple languages can actually uphold the idea that languages are separate, as it can create boundaries between the different languages that are in the art or media. He also argues that languages are often made up or created often for political reasons. For example, a language can be split into two to separate two different regions, or it can be joined together to create a national language and bring a country together, for example. And he actually questions the idea of language itself, as he says that it's often a European idea that countries imposed onto places that were colonised, when in reality the use of language can be a lot more fluid than that, and people who are multilingual don't always speak languages that are completely separate, and they often mix languages together. So this can lead us to question whether plurilingualism can really happen in art or in media, or if it actually reinforces the idea that languages are separate and creates boundaries between them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that languages, they're obviously inherently quite political throughout history. Language has always been used as a way to control populations, communities. So there is always going to be that idea that there is like a political idea behind it. But I also think I think it's difficult to kind of eradicate translation completely. I mean, I know from personal experience, like learning a language, I'm relying on translation constantly. And I think translation really bridges two languages together. Without translation in today's day and age, I don't think it'd be able to communicate effectively. I think it's a really nice idea that we shouldn't really be relying on translation. I think thinking of languages rather than as separate languages as these entities that can be mixed, I think that's a great idea. But I also think we can't necessarily like write off history and like ignore what has happened, because it is through colonization that now we do have these separate languages. It is through that, but we can't all of a sudden say, oh, we don't need plurilingualism anymore, we don't need translation, because at the end of the day it has happened, we do need it. It's just a matter of using it appropriately. Maybe, okay, I can put my hand up and say I rely on translation way too much, maybe I shouldn't do that as often, but I think we do need the presence of translation. We do need the presence of plurilingualism. Otherwise, we're just never going to be able to communicate effectively across different languages.
Yeah, definitely. I agree as well. I don't think I could survive without translation, like especially as a languages student.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it can really help to sort of spread ideas and like cultures across to different languages to like enable people to experience them who maybe wouldn't have been able to understand it in the original language.
Yeah. But I think it's also quite visible through other media examples. I looked at this one TV show. It's on Netflix. It's called 1899. It was cancelled after the first season, but essentially it was about a group of immigrants travelling on a ship from London to New York in 1899, and they all spoke different languages. And obviously 1899, there's no translation devices, no such thing as AI. So they're all relying on each other to try and get through this journey. And there's a bunch of different supernatural occurrences, and it's quite strange, but they are relying on each other, but they can't understand each other. So they use body language and things like that to communicate. And they also rely on these multilingual individuals to try and communicate. And there's also this idea of, like, obviously plurilingualism, you use all the languages in your language repertoire, even if you're not fluent in them. And there's quite a few individuals who maybe they're not fluent in a language, but it is obvious that they can understand these languages. And I think it's like a really nice show of how plurilingualism is needed I know it was set in 1899, but I think it's a nice example of how it is needed to be able to appreciate and understand languages, trying to communicate with each other.
Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting with the representation of plurilingualism and how people can communicate even when maybe they don't fully understand the same languages as each other.
Yeah.
Another example of plurilingualism in the media that I found is a popular French singer called Aya Nakamura, who uses different languages in her music. She's French and Malian because she was born in Mali and she grew up in Paris. So she is influenced by different varieties of French and also Bambara, which is the language spoken in Mali. And from growing up in Paris, she was also influenced by lots of different languages because obviously this is an area where lots of different languages are present, which you can really see in her music. One of her most popular songs is called Jaja, which has had 1 billion views on YouTube.
Mais comment ça, le monde est hyper. Tu croyais quoi, qu'on se verrait plus jamais. Je pourrais t'afficher, mais c'est pas mon délire. D'après les rumeurs, tu m'as eu dans ton lit. Oh, Jaja, y'a pas moyen, Jaja. J'suis pas ta cata, Jaja. Genre, en katana, baby, tu dettes ça. Oh, Jaja, y'a pas moyen, Jaja. J'suis pas ta cata, Jaja. Genre, en katana, baby, tu dettes ça.
Her music has become popular as well as in France, also in other European countries and in West African countries, which shows how plurilingualism can maybe make music sort of more popular, or like across different cultures, because she obviously is influenced by lots of different languages in her songs. And I also saw in an interview she said that she sings exactly how she would talk with her friends, which I think shows that she does include various languages in a really natural way, which represents how plurilingualism works in everyday life and in everyday conversations.
Yeah. I think it's just like another example how plurilingual art is such a useful tool. I mean, the examples we've seen, TV shows, music, comic strips, like it's always been art that's been used to reinforce plurilingualism, which I mean, the overall question, can plurilingual art, exist? I think those examples clearly show that there is definitely a possibility of it. They do exist, and they do clearly work, especially with the singer you mentioned. If people in West Africa and European countries are listening to it, it does show that, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that art and media can be a really great way to represent plurilingualism in a really positive way for people from lots of different cultures.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there is also that element, to play devil's advocate, there is that element that translation will be included. And if you do go through the idea through the reading that we mentioned, that translation means that languages are separate, there is translation in the comic strips and in the TV show. There's subtitles. I'm sure the music, probably there are translated lyrics out there somewhere. So, I mean, in that sense, translation is included. These languages are separate. Is that still plurilingual art?
Yeah, I guess this is the question.
Yeah.
I think... I mean, I do still definitely think there can be plurilingual art, but I think it's also important to keep in mind like the idea of translation and maybe why it could be questioned.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, there isn't going to be any individual out there that can understand every single language. There's always going to be some sort of misunderstanding, it's always going to be there. And I think with plurilingual art, even though there is some translation included, I think this misunderstanding, it does really put the reader, the listener, whoever it is, the audience, in the shoes of the person who's meant to receive, the way that it should be received. As in, like with the TV show, for example, obviously the characters in that TV show, they're not understanding what's going on. And as a viewer, you can see that, and you will also be misunderstanding with them. I think without that misunderstanding there, you wouldn't fully be able to experience the show in the way it should be experienced. I think it does add to it. And I think I think plurilingual art is possible. I think translation is needed. But at the same time, I think the misunderstanding is also needed. So yeah, thank you to our listeners. Be sure to look out for the next episode. We'll be focusing more on the German lens of plurilingualism. But yeah, thank you. Au revoir.
Thank you. Bye.